Now, this is the second lesson on why the slave trade was abolished in England in the year 1785 to 1807. Now, as mentioned in the last lesson, I'm going to focus on just the humanitarian campaigns for now. It's more important that we go through these things in depth, especially for this unit, as there's a guaranteed question to come up on why the slave trade was abolished. So first thing, just to make sure that you develop your knowledge from last lesson, is there's 11 questions here. It's best to pause the video and get them done. First question is, what is an interpretation? It's quite important to know that for the skill that we're using for this question, and also for your coursework later on. What does humanitarian mean? What does enlightenment mean? What did Quakers believe in regards to human suffering? Why did most people in Britain ignore the slave trade? What did Quakers do in 1783? Why did women Quakers get involved in the abolition of the slave trade? What was the name of the publication from 1783 and who did the Quakers send it to? Name two individuals who were evangelical Christians and what did they do to help abolish the slave trade? How does humanitarianism and religion link? And what group did the Quakers and the evangelical Christians set up to try and abolish the slave trade? So there's 11 questions there. Best bet is to pause the video and answer those in as much detail as you can to try and recall what we did last lesson. The question 11 especially will be what we're doing in today's lesson. So if you pause the video now, answer the questions, spend about 5 minutes doing them. If you're not sure on any of them, then go back to the last lesson and see if you can get the answers to them. So, before going on to the main concept of the lesson today, which is looking at the society for affecting the abolition of the slave trade, it must be understood that these are the 4 things that we need to know for this part of the course. And the exam board will ask a specific question. The extracts that the exam board produce or put in the exam paper will be based around one of the, well, two or more of these things. The chances the exam board will focus on 2 specifically. Now it says here, you must understand the exam board may not use the exact language of this in the real thing. I'm going to show you the last 3 years and what questions they've had on this topic. And it shows you that you need to understand where to group it in to get it right. They may pick a line from an extract and base it around this, and they might reword certain aspects. Now, the extracts will cover at least 2 of the areas. Remember, you only need to discuss what the extracts discuss. Now, you can bring in other historians and arguments, but it's not vital. To get to the top level of level 5, the exam board want you to understand what the extracts say, develop what's convincing about them, develop what is less convincing about them, and then make a comparison. And overall, in the grand scheme of things, the exam board want you to look at the 2 extracts and say, which one do you think is the more convincing extract about why the slave trade was abolished? We mustn't move away from this whole concept that both of these extracts are about why the slave trade was abolished in Britain in 1807. So in June 2017, the question was, in light of differing interpretations, how convincing do you find the view that abolition of the slave trade was achieved through the campaigning of non-conformist Christians? Now, that's basically everything we're looking at now. Because they use that phrase, non-conformist Christians, it threw a lot of people, this question did. So you need to make sure that you have an understanding that if you see non-conformist Christians, then you base it around the concept of humanitarian campaigns and the influence of religion. So in June 2017, there were 2 extracts. One of them was about humanitarianism and religion, and the other one was about key individuals. So, I mean, personally, as this course goes on, you will realise how humanitarian campaigns, religion, link to key individuals, because we talk about Thomas Clarkson and William Wilberforce as a humanitarian reformer as well. In June 2018, the question was, in light of differing interpretations, how convincing do you find the view that the abolition of the slave trade was due to the desire of the middle classes for humanitarian reform. That picked out a quote from extract 1. Now with that focused very much on, number 1, humanitarian campaigns, and number 2, the economic side in terms of the growth of the middle class. Because remember, around 1785, well, we were starting to industrialize, and this created this new middle class. And basically, I mean, it's a humanitarian campaign question again. Whereas June 2017 had more focus on religion, June 2018 had more focus on humanitarianism, which you must bring religion in. June 2019, last year's paper, was a lot easier because it just made it very clear. In light of differing interpretations, how convincing do you find the view that the slave trade ended because of the fear of slave rebellions? Now again, they used a different word there, rebellions, whereas in the scheme of learning it says resistance. So just be aware, the only thing that has not come up yet as a significant separate factor is the role of key individuals. And also you could say economic and financial factors. So it's very difficult to predict. These are the last 3 questions, and we will do all 3 of these questions before we obviously go to the exam next year. It's very difficult to find example practice for this because there has only been 3 papers. But you must understand that the wording might be different to the actual specification. So be careful of that. It's about picking out the right bullet point that you've got to discuss. And we're going to look at June 2017 after we've done today's lesson. And that's going to be your first practice write-up. So we've done task 1, the starter questions. Now the actual task 1 is we're going to look at how the Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade helped with abolition. So question 11 on the starter, what group did the Quakers and the evangelical Christians set up to try and abolish the slave trade? The answer is the Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade. Now, your first task for this lesson is I want you, during the next 3 slides of information, to complete the following table. On one side, arguments that the society actually helped abolish slave trade. On the other side, argument that the society did not help abolish the slave trade. Now, I'm going to go through this at the end, but I'm only going to go through a very diluted version. You must add the detail and the specific facts before we go on to looking at the actual extracts and the practice. Now, there is quite a bit of information, and some of it isn't as relevant as others, but you need to make sure that you understand the key concepts. So, again, I will stop and I will add certain bits in. I'll also underline the key things. Now, in terms of the traditional view, the creation of this group is seen as very important. The creation of this group is seen as sort of a figurehead, and it says here, has given more weight to the view of humanitarian and morality being the main reason why the slave trade was abolished. So this group tends to have more influence than Quakers and evangelical Christians on their own. The society was unrivaled as a lobby group, and from its creation in 1787, they campaigned tirelessly to have the slave trade abolished. So they were created in 1787, and the key term here is they campaigned tirelessly. Now, what needs to be understood is that in the late 1780s, Britain was benefiting hugely from the slave trade. The reason that Britain was benefiting so much from the slave trade was because of the materials that were being sold. And these materials were being made by slaves. One big example is sugar, okay? A lot of items in Britain were actually being made in the plantations in America. So what we need to understand is lots of people in Britain who were benefiting hugely. One group that was benefiting massively were the ship owners, because they were taking slave ships from Britain to Africa, and they were doing that golden triangle journey that we discussed last lesson. So, the Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade And what you'll notice is throughout this, I'm just going to shorten it to the society. Okay, they were made up of social reformers, people who wanted to cause change, with strong religious backgrounds. That links because there's one phrase we're going to use later. The reason this society was so effective was because they had an idea. They had a clear outline of what they wanted to do. They never backed down from their overall message. Okay? And because of their strong religious background, the abolition campaign of the society was seen as a moral crusade. What that means is a way of trying to change people's perceptions. Okay? And the reason this group actually were driven to do this was because their conscience said it. Their conscience couldn't sit back and look at the suffering of millions of Africans throughout this slave trade. So this was seen as a moral crusade to improve, number one, the lives of the people who had gone through the suffering, and number two, to actually, Quakers were part of this group, and they wanted to ensure that no harm was coming to people, because they believed that if you're harming a person, you're harming God. So there's that moral religious concept that this society stood for. And that means it was really focused, and we're going to go on to this later, but a lot of people in Britain were religious. So this society had a big impact on encouraging people to turn against the slave trade, even though it massively benefited the country. So the idea of a moral crusade had been the idea that several historians have made on the slave trade. So quite a few historians have actually said, yes, humanitarianism and religious factors were the key reason why the slave trade was abolished. One of the main historians was a man called Robert Anstey. And he put his argument across for the first time in 1968, where he expanded an article, The Atlantic Slave Trade and British Abolition. Now, he set out the case saying that the abolitionists were championing a cause against trade, which at the time was very profitable. He put a lot of his argument in the fact that key groups and key individuals were vital to the abolition of the slave trade. They were championing a cause. Now, there were a few things that this historian argues against. Now, this is something you might not understand fully. But this historian disagreed because apparently in 1796, government were very close, the Commons were very close to passing a law which would have abolished slavery. Now, Ansey's he's very annoyed by this because he believes that never occurred. Because in 1796, Britain was still reaping the rewards of slavery. Britain were benefiting hugely. So the argument is that this historian is saying without groups such as Society for Effecting the Abolition of the slave trade may never have fully been abolished. Okay? There's no way that he's arguing that politics was the main reason, because he thinks that a lot of politicians actually benefited from this. So without these humanitarian groups, the whole concept of the slave trade being abolished might never have occurred. Now, there is some historians, and this is an argument against the society, some historians have become more sceptical on the thesis, the idea that humanitarianism and religion was key to abolition. A lot of historians like to focus on the economic and political changes. But there's a reason for this. If you look at the last bullet point, it may be because some historians prefer to write about topics which don't make Britain look bad. Some historians want to focus on the concept that it was because Britain was changing that we stepped away from this slave trade. Because politics was becoming more sympathetic, we stepped away from this slave trade. But actually, it might be the case that they said this because they didn't want Britain to look overly bad by condoning a very cruel practice. These people believe that by saying humanitarianism was the main reason, is that saying Britain was a cruel country for benefiting from the slave trade. However, historians like Ansey go down the route, basically, that the cruelty. So Ansey goes down the concept that the slave trade was cruel, and that humanitarianism was key to pointing out how cruel it was. If it wasn't for humanitarianism, ANSI is suggesting that the people such as the Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade, if they weren't putting the harsh message across, then people might never have known about the slave trade. People might not have known about the inhumanity of the slave trade. Because don't forget, around 1785 onwards, there was still a lot going on in other countries, for example, France. So it was important to keep this at the forefront of people's ideas. Now, one example that you could use in the exam of a really cruel action towards the slaves is this one here, the slave ship Zong. Now, the slave ship Zong was controlled by Captain Luke Collingwood. And the thing that stands out about the slave ship Zong is that during the journey, Collingwood ordered that 133 slaves were thrown overboard during the last stage of the journey while they were still alive. The reason for this is because the food on the ship was short. So this man ordered that 133 slaves were thrown overboard while they were still alive. What he then intended to do was to make an insurance claim on the slaves. And this went to court. Now, a lot of people might think that Collingwood was in trouble for throwing slaves overboard. He actually wasn't brought to court about that. The reason he was brought to court was because he was trying to defraud the insurance, not because he killed 133 slaves. It was actually ruled in court that killing slaves is acceptable on certain occasions, and one of those being if the food was short. The case of the slave ship Zong shows the lack of morality which links to the moral crusade concept, and historians such as ANSI use the moral crusade argument to say that if it wasn't for humanitarianism using moral crusade, it may never have been abolished. So this group, the Society for Effecting of Abolition of Slave Trade, were very important to the overall abolition because of their use of the moral crusade concept. By using events like the slave ship Zong to get people to realise just how cruel the concept of a slave trade was. Their religious actions were always in the backdrop, but the fact that they were trying to get people to realise how cruel the slave trade was is really important to the overall abolition. Some historians believe, others totally discredit it. Now, this is where we go into a bit more detail about what they did. So, this group was set up to try and get rid of something that was very successful for Britain. 24% of Britain's annual income was because of the slave trade and the industries that were created because of it. So shipbuilding, you know, the taxes from the docks and the ports, the goods that were brought into the country. This group, the Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade, faced a monumentally difficult task. Some people thought that their task was impossible because they were trying to remove something that was ridiculously profitable. And they faced a lot of opposition. So this is one reason why they might not have been as effective. One group that they faced opposition from were a group known as the West India Lobby. Now, this group was made up of sugar planters in the West Indies whose business actually existed because of the slave trade. This group benefited from the slaves making sugar and that sugar being sold on to countries like Britain. Now, it wasn't just this, but there were also links with the MPs in Britain. This group, the West India Lobby, actually had close relationships with British Parliament, and by the late 1700s, it was said that 50 MPs were tied to the group. So it could suggest that MPs of Britain at this time were financially benefiting from companies who took advantage of slaves. Now, this is where the Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade struggled, Because if MPs are actively benefiting from this group and this whole concept, then it's going to be very hard to pass legislation through the House of Commons. But despite this task, this is why this group was so important. Despite the task, the society faced to remove this, they stood by their message and pressed the case. The key thing about this group, and this is one thing that I think you could use in an exam really well, they never lost their identity. They never lost the message they stood for. It was really focused and important that they use it. So the strength and the dedication of the society showed that humanitarianism was key. The removal of the slave trade became devotion for these people, and their educational campaign lasted for 20 years. This was a gradual removal of the abolition of the slave trade. And that's another phrase that you can use. The reason this group was so important is because it was a gradual abolition. It was a group that did not give up, and they devoted many years to the cause. They realised that this was going to be a long-term removal, a long-term education of the people. They realised one thing, that people were not going to give up the slave trade overnight. The reason for it is because it benefited so many people. Now, the main thing that the society did that helped abolish the slave trade was using propaganda to emphasise the extreme nature of the trade, to show the inhumane practice that occurred. They made thousands of pamphlets that were produced and were supported with emotive images. Now, there's two that I'm going to show you. The first one is this one here. Now, this is a very famous plaque of a supplicant slave. This slave is praying. You can see they're in chains. You can see they've lost their dignity potentially in this picture. And the quote at the bottom says, "Am I not a man and a brother?" It's showing that equality that the slaves were striving for, and showing that regardless of who they were still equal to anyone else. And that's what the society wanted to get across. That slaves were the same as everyone else. They were, sons of God. They were people that had to be looked after. And by showing this became very much a focal point to the society's propaganda. Another image that was shown to show the inhumane nature was the drawing of the cross-section of the slave ship Brooks, which is this here. Now, why this became so iconic is because it showed the cross-section. It showed how the slaves were being packed into ships. And it showed the inhumane practice of basically slaves having no room, slaves being chained, different layers of them under the slave ship. And these two images became very iconic. These became very famous for the society using these to try and get people on their side. Now, this is another key thing here. These images drew attention to the moral arguments adopted by the society, and it shows how they got support. By 1792, people had signed 519 petitions. One of the most significant aspects of support they got was in 1787 in Manchester. 10,700 people signed a petition against the slave trade, and Manchester's population was 50,000. This shows that the society had a huge impact on the people of Manchester, but they were also starting to get the backing of the population. Regardless of this practice being so beneficial, people were starting to turn against it because they were learning about the inhumanity of it. And this is the last slide of information. Obviously, I'm going into a lot of detail here, so it will take you a couple of watches to get this done. But the last bit. The reason this group was so appealing was because of the message it stood for. As it says there, the importance of the humanitarian movement lies in the appeal it created. In the late 1700s, a vast majority of people were religious, and they all had an opinion on mortality. Also, the moral aspect of it. So they had an opinion on people, on the death of the slaves, but they also had an opinion on what they thought was morality and what they thought, how they thought people should be treated. By appealing to this, the society were able to maintain momentum, as their arguments were driven by conscience rather than environmental circumstances. What they did is they played on people's emotional responses, and they linked it to religious ideas. Now, this bit's a bit of a challenge, this bit, for the actual society. But even when events such as the French Revolution occurred, the debate on slavery did not disappear due to moral reasoning. So the key thing here, I'll add, even when there were huge changes across Europe, slavery, slave trade, and the abolition message never disappeared. And a lot of people could say this was down to the devotion of the society. They never let the idea and the removal of the slave trade go out of anyone's minds. So the fact they were always there, giving pamphlets, producing propaganda, shows that they were always vital to the actual abolition of the slave trade. Even when there was some concerns about the movement, there were some whispers of Jacobinism within the society. Now, a Jacobinite is someone who is basically like a terrorist. They were a radical group that were formed in the French Revolution, and there were some whispers that these individuals were part of this society, trying to enforce it. But that was just a whisper. But the key thing was that this group was always able to maintain presence in Parliament, which ensured that the issue would never be forgotten. Now, the persistence, the constant drumming of the message in society saw a bill in favour of abolition being presented every year for 8 years by the MP for Hull, William Wilberforce. Because of this society, in the year 1791 to 99, William Wilberforce presented a bill to Parliament to try and abolish the slave trade. Every attempt was unsuccessful, but the key thing was, because the society got William Wilberforce on their side, each attempt to try and have it abolished was like a memorial for the slaves being killed, and the need to remember the inhumane nature of the cause. So without the society getting Wilberforce on side, they may never have had such a presence in the House of Commons. Now, William Wilberforce we're going to look at in massive detail later on, but Wilberforce was an absolute driving force. He managed to keep the message of slave abolition in Parliament, even when there were some really awful actions that were committed in other areas. So the one thing you'll notice when we look at this course later is that slaves resisted quite regularly. And there was, in Haiti, the Haitian Revolution in 1791, when slaves killed 4,000 white people and burned 180 plantations. Even in times of this, in crisis, where MPs basically would have said, well, the slaves don't deserve to be set free because of their actions, William Wilberforce and the Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade were able to keep their message at the front of politics and sort of dispel any of the bad press that was happening. And eventually, William Wilberforce got the support of William Pitt in 1804, and William Pitt's, the person next in line from William Pitt, William Grenville, in 1806, with the abolition in 1807. But without the Society for the Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade, would there got William Wilberforce? So this is what I've put. Now you've got to add to this, okay? And there are just a couple of bits missing. So what I'll do is make this a little bit smaller so you can see every bit. Okay. So, arguments that the society helped: high campaigning, reformers with religious backgrounds. It was based on morality and conscience. They were fighting a cause which was profitable, which shows their moral fight. They were calling for abolition in the time of the sugar boom. They were going to be unpopular, but they helped raise awareness for inhumane practice such as the slave ship Zong. They stood by their message even when there were questions. So Jacobinism, opposition from the West India lobby, long-term devotion, use of propaganda. They appealed to the religious nature of the country. Petitions, 519 were signed in 1792, and in 1787 they got 10,700 people to sign a petition in Manchester, which was quite a shock when Manchester benefited highly from the slave trade. Arguments that the society didn't help. I mean, it's difficult. Some historians argue that economic and political changes had more of an impact. The society faced a range of issues such as the West India lobby. They didn't want to lose their wealth. The rumours of Jacobinism in the society due to the time of the revolution shows that the group were seen as potential terrorists. And trying to win over members of parliament when members of parliament had commercial links to some of the slave trade benefits, such as the West India lobby. Without the role of William Wilberforce, you could say it was going to be very difficult for the society to have their message put across. But the key thing was they were a devoted group who spent a lot of time developing their message. Right, so now it's best to pause. You can use the information that I've done, but also add to it. There's a lot of information here, there really is. But in a minute, you're going to see just how much this is being overtaught. So you can develop the interpretations response. You're going to see an A-star answer. And this is going to show you just how much, or maybe how little some of you might need. Because this question is not about reams of knowledge. It's about understanding interpretations. So spend about 25-30 minutes on completing this table. Pause the video, and then we'll move on to the last task that I'm going to do a little bit of explaining for, and then I'm going to give you an optional task which can be done over the next 3-4 weeks. So the second thing we're going to look at this morning is interpretation practice. Now, as I've said, these are the last 3 years' questions on this topic. And what we're going to look at is June 2017. In light of differing interpretations, how convincing do you find the view that the abolition of the slave trade was achieved through campaigning of non-conformist Christians? This is the extract. It was from James Walvin, A Short History of Slavery, published in 2007. Unlike paper 2, this doesn't matter. You don't need to talk about the provenance at all. It's totally just there to say who said it, okay? So this says, from the 1780s, a large number of non-conformist missionaries began Christianizing slave communities in the Caribbean. Many Anglicans disliked the ability of Methodists to create youtheisms among people of weak judgment and of little or no knowledge. Whether among slaves in the Caribbean or among working class people in Britain, despite this, the missionary work had remarkable consequences. Non-conformist Christians created a growing band of British supporters of black freedom. The Baptists and Methodists who were converting the slaves in the Caribbean were also growing rapidly in Britain, changing the face of British worship, and British non-conformists naturally felt a bond of sympathy for their enslaved co-religionists. Nonconformity clearly became a major social force in Britain, providing the campaign against slavery with a new national network of support. Moreover, it was growing most rapidly in new industrialising areas of population growth. It was as if the people of the new Britain, the Britain we normally associate with industrial change, were the very people who lent their numbers and gave a voice to demands for an end to slavery. First thing, you don't need to understand every word in this. You need to understand an overall message. There are some phrases here which, number one, I don't fully understand at times and I have to go and look at. Number two, one thing I have done is I've bolded all of the statements that I think I can link knowledge to. Now, the key thing with this is that we are able to, number one, give the overall message. What is this extract saying was the main reason for the abolition of the slave trade? Then, pick a part which is convincing. Pick a quote. Back it up with your own knowledge. Link that to the concept of slavery abolition. Then pick another quote. Tell me why that's convincing with your own knowledge. Pick another quote. Tell me why that's convincing with your own knowledge. And then what part of this might you disagree with? And then overall, the argument that Welvin presents is fairly, slightly, or very strong for the abolition debate because. One of the main things I want to see this week is I want you to do your first write-up for an extract. It should be no longer than a page. I'm just going to show you what someone wrote in the real thing. This got an A star, and hopefully it should show you, and then I'll show you one that I wrote. It says, Welvin, so Welvin's the historian, you can just write extract 1, attributes the end of the slave trade to the work of non-conformist Christians throughout the period. There we go, straight away, what this person's done. They've understood the overall message. That's the first thing. They understand the overall message. Okay? Suggesting that missionary work had remarkable consequences. They've gone straight into their quote. Now, this is something that they are seeing as convincing. This view seems sound. I don't like that. It seems very informal, but you could say this view seems fairly convincing, considering the Quakers were the first to vocally oppose the trade, establishing their Committee Against the Slave Trade in 1783 and distributing pamphlets promoting their cause for the MPs and general public in 1784. What this person does here very well is they give specific and detailed evidence to support the quote. I don't think it's as detailed as it should be. It could add more. For example, you could talk about the plaque. You could talk about the slave ship Brooks. You could also talk a bit more about the moral crusade, their overall message. But this is a solid start. Now, obviously, I'm not showing you the introduction or anything. This person just goes straight in, okay? The next bit, once again, they start with knowledge. The Quakers, also joined in opposition by evangelical Christians who believed the trade to be a sin, and due to the nature of their religion, they spoke openly against it to persuade others. And they've used another quote, providing the campaign against slavery with new ... support. These two non-conformist religions then joined together, establishing the Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade to promote their disapproval. By 1807, the Society had 1,200 branches, suggesting that Welvin's interpretation of the slave trade ended because of non-conformist efforts stands strong, as it was these religions that gave voice, quote, gave voice to the need to end slavery first and throughout the period. Now, personally, I don't think this is, it's good. There are aspects of it being really strong. They've used quotes. We've got a quote here. We've got a quote back up here. And we've got a good range of knowledge. The one thing that this candidate doesn't do, number one, they don't discuss how important the evidence is to the abolition. Number two, their evidence is limited in places. They don't tell me about Clarkson, Granville. They don't talk about the moral crusade. They don't talk about the propaganda. They don't talk about their devotion. Lots of things. I mean, this was one of the only sections about this extract in this piece. There's lots more they could have spoke about. But what they do well is they clearly understand the evidence. They clearly understand the interpretation, and they make judgments throughout. So where the person says, suggesting that Walvin's interpretation that the slave trade ended because of non-conformist efforts. If you have a look there, they actually wrote humanitarian efforts and realised they've not worded the question, so they crossed it out and put non-conformist efforts stands strong. Those last two words there are their judgment. Stand strong is enough. A bit like in that first section where they said sound. It's very clear that this is, you know, it is a good answer. It's a good answer for the pressure and the time conditions. That's the most important thing. So what I've done is I've also written a little section. Okay. Extract 1 focused on the concept that non-conformist Christians were the key foundation to the overall abolition of the slave trade. At this stage, the argument must be deemed fairly strong due to the understanding that religion and humanitarian beliefs linked, which in turn could link to the moral crusade which the abolition was seen. I said what the interpretation is saying. If I want to make that stronger, I might put a quote in there. Then I get on to the actual discussion of the interpretation. Walvin discusses how nonconformists created a growing band of British supporters of black freedom. This argument must be seen as quite strong due to the fact that the Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade was developed in the 1780s, stemming from groups such as the Quakers and the Evangelical Christians. The role of the group was to use propaganda to encourage, etc., etc. I've just gone and given loads of knowledge there. That's more detailed knowledge. My advice would be for each extract in each section to use a quote in your overall message, and then, so basically what I want you to do is to write this up, but make sure that you are using a quote in the following places. Here, 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 and here. You can use the same quote in certain places. So in your overall section, if you want to use another quote, that's fine. Okay. Now, these might not be perfect to start off with. I'm not expecting them to be. I'd like you to attempt it and show me. Even if you're a little bit unsure, just use this writing frame for now, and then we can develop the writing skills as we go on in this course. But don't forget, the coursework is based on this as well. So the more practice we do with this, the easier, hopefully, the coursework will be in the long run. So the optional task for this week, the main thing is to do the table and to do the interpretations write-up. Now, this isn't optional. This isn't the most important task for today, but the best thing to do for each of these bullet points is to create an A3 sheet as an overview of the topic. So we've done bullet point 1, the importance of humanitarian campaigns and the influence of religion. Next Tuesday, we're going to look at the economic and financial factors, which is very small. Then we're going to look at the individuals, and then we're going to look at the changing political climate, slave resistance, which is, again, also very small. The key thing for this week is, what I'd like you to submit on Show My Homework or by email next Tuesday is your interpretation practice typed up, or a photo, but typed up is preferable. I'll then mark this. The rest of the work, just file away, take your time with it. It doesn't need to be 100% finished today. And then over the next few days, I'm going to be sending you video feedback on the last essay you did to me. They're marked and I've scanned them into a computer. I just need to create video and send them separately. I want it to be like the real thing. I want you to benefit from feedback. So I'll do the same thing with your interpretation practice to make sure that you fully understand where you're going right and where you're going wrong. And then we can go and take it to the next level. So if you have any questions, obviously just pop me an email. This will take you a little while to get your heads around. Don't think that you're failing if you don't understand it first time. And just make sure that you get the information. And if you don't understand any of the words, don't be embarrassed to Google them, okay? It's really important that at this stage, we're building our vocabulary. The exam's still a year and 2 months away. So you've got lots of time to get your head around this. Okay, so we've now finished humanitarian campaigners. Next lesson, we'll move on, look at economic and political changes.